And good morning and welcome to Washington. I particularly appreciate the experiment the Africa Center is doing with this group to have a mix of new leaders as well as returning leaders in a different type of format. I think one of the things I consider Africa Center to be really a premier security institution focused on Africa within the U.S. government. And ACSS, I think, continues to strive to innovate and try new approaches to security engagements and dialogues. I think you're already aware there's also a group of young African leaders in town. One of the President Obama's initiatives, the Young African Leadership Initiative, has 500 Mandela scholars who are here in town this week as well. And I think there may be some opportunities for you to meet with one another, but it's a wonderful confluence. The other thing I wanted to mention, it was brought to my attention that actually just 1 year ago today was the Africa Leaders Summit that was hosted by President Obama and that involved heads of state from all across the African continent. That was a very significant event in terms of bringing together here in Washington for the first time so many of the leaders at the highest level of government to talk about the range of issues with respect to the United States and Africa, and I think broad conceptions of security. And part of what I'd like to do this morning is, from a Department of Defense perspective, speak to what the U.S. strategic approach is with respect to Africa, and how that is translated by Department of Defense, given our security lens, what that means for us, and leave some time at the end for some initial dialogue, give and take. I'd also mention that later this week on Friday, I'll return to see you along with my colleague from the State Department, Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, and we'll be part of a panel discussion. And I would just invite you, whether it's today or whether it's on Friday, when you have your short list of things that you really wish that U.S. government policymakers really understood, whether it's about your country, whether it's about your region, whether it's about kind of how to tackle some of the security challenges, to please take the opportunity and let me know, because there's no substitute for getting direct feedback. And with such an esteemed and senior group here, I would really like to benefit from your wisdom as well. So whether it's this morning or whether it's on Friday, when we see one another again, please do not hesitate. I know you won't in a group like this, but to give me your views, and so that can inform the work that we do. What I'd like to do just briefly is talk about the strategic environment from a U.S. perspective, of course, the strategic approach, as I mentioned, and then maybe do a little bit of a tour d'horizon region by region within the continent, and then open it up to some questions and answers. And from that perspective, I think for Americans, there's a tendency, if you're not involved in working with Africa on a day-to-day basis, to look at an entire continent and somehow misunderstand that there are 54 very different countries, as different as Texas is from Alaska in the United States, similar differences to Mozambique and Ghana, for example. I mean, just very different, excuse me, from one country to next, the culture, the geography, all of it. And part of what I spend my time doing with American audiences is trying to explain that differentiation so that they understand that the Africa that we see in the media, that most media representations tends to focus on the problems and the challenges and not all of the excellent and productive things that are happening, that it's not a monolithic place whatsoever, that you have some of the fastest growing economies in the world alongside some of the poorest ones, that you have massive technological change sweeping through the continent, just all of the applications with respect to telecommunications, the internet, and the innovation that's happening with respect to medicine, banking, agriculture, industry, economic change, and social change is just tremendous. The youth population, I think, is something, with the youth leaders here this week as well, it's something President Obama focused on a fair amount in his recent trip also. But just this tremendous youthful population of Africa and what a benefit that can be in terms of economic potential going forward, or what a liability it can be, and probably how it will be different from country to country depending on how youth populations are approached and enabled. I know in the United States we see a lot with respect to the resource and hydrocarbon sectors within Africa, but maybe less so in terms of the vulnerabilities at times of economies that are focused on hydrocarbons to price changes. So, thinking back to the Texas and Alaska example, at least for the United States, both of those states are highly dependent on hydrocarbon resources, and when the prices go down, it's a significant problem. And of course, that's the same in hydrocarbon-focused African countries as well. I think one of the trends that's very impressive and is not as visible at times is the progress when it comes to governance and democratic approaches within African countries. More than 40 countries at this point conduct multi-party elections on a regular basis. And I think that is something, sometimes there's still a mindset that thinks that, coups are the way that regimes change in Africa, and that's really not the case. That's now the exception and never was the rule. I think the events in Burkina Faso and Nigeria in particular this year, for those who were paying attention, were very noteworthy in terms of peaceful change, two different paths to peaceful change, but very notable. And much less cross-border conflict across African countries, but a growing element of violent extremism in some regions that's very concerning, and that, at least in the United States, we hear a lot about in terms of the media. So that's a kind of general perspective from a U.S. perspective in terms of continental scale developments and trends, many of which are highly encouraging. But domestic conflict and some governments' inability to meet basic security needs still remain an obstacle in certain countries to democratic governance, economic growth, and human development. And one of the things that we look at is the work that's being done by academics and by non-governmental organizations that measures things like fragility, putting together comprehensive indices. And when you look at some of that external work, it's very noteworthy that they highlight large portions of the Sahel as well as Central Africa as being among the most fragile areas in the world. From a U.S. strategic perspective, the president directed U.S. departments and agencies to develop an Africa strategy a few years ago now that was memorialized in a presidential policy directive. And I won't belabor it because I imagine many people read it at the time. But it had 4 pillars, and I think those bear repeating because they really are the guideposts when it comes to the U.S. strategic approach. And the pillars include strengthening democratic institutions, spurring economic growth, trade, and investment, advancing peace and security, and promoting opportunity and development. I would just take the moment here to mention something that was a significant effort on the part of African countries, heads of state, finance and economic ministers, engaging here in Washington with members of Congress and the administration, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA, which provides some important trade preferences, was renewed at the end of June for an additional 10 years. That was a huge goal in the course of the Africa Leaders Summit a year ago, focused on the number one thing that heads of state told President Obama was that we want to see AGOA extended. And that's something that he can't do by himself. He has to do it with our Congress. And as you probably know, it can be difficult to get enough members of Congress to agree on anything to move forward. But they did, and in a very resounding fashion. And I think that's worth highlighting, even though we're in a forum that's focused more on peace and security, that critical element of engagement with respect to trade and investment is in place, and will extend for another 10 years before we will need to re-engage with Congress in that regard. In terms of partnership, a few things that I'd like to mention with respect to our overall approach. The fundamental U.S. approach is to focus on empowering and enabling partners, and working with partners who want to work with us, and seeking to engage and enable partners to provide for their own security in ways that strengthen political, economic, and democratic vitality. From a DoD perspective, what this means is engaging with partners in innovative security cooperation activities and seeking to do it in what we call a small footprint way, but seeking to have the amount of presence required to engage, but no more than that. So that's a bit on our small footprint approach. Specifically for DoD, at a global scale, we're very focused, as you know, on irregular warfare and counterterrorism as a mission set, something that affects the U.S. homeland directly, as well as the stability in many different partner countries in multiple regions around the world. And so we seek to maintain a stabilizing approach to building partnership capacity. What I'd like to do is mention several specific objectives with respect to Africa from a DoD approach. And these are our DoD Africa strategy that nests within the President's strategy that I was citing earlier in terms of the multiple pillars. So part of the way that we seek to advance peace and security includes undermining the ability of Al-Qaeda and affiliates, as well as other violent extremist organizations in Africa, to strike partners' interests or U.S. interests, to include U.S. citizens who are overseas. A second objective relates to maintaining freedom of movement within Africa and adjacent sea lanes to enable the free flow of goods and services. A third objective relates to building partnership capacity to enable partners' security forces and institutions to combat a wide range of transnational threats. And I'm including in this things like proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, piracy, and illicit trafficking. A fourth objective relates to building capacity of partner security forces with respect to peace operations, or peacekeeping if you prefer, crisis response, and the prevention of mass atrocities. And a final objective, and really a foundational one, is to work with partner military forces in particular with respect to operating under civilian authority, respect for the rule of law, and abiding by international human rights norms and standards to contribute to stability in respective states. So this has to do with the military as a profession and the military's professionalism. So if those are taken at a continental scale in terms of the objectives from a DoD perspective, how do we go about doing that? What are the ways? So using the kind of ends, ways, means typology, if you will, I would say the primary way has to do with building partnership capacity, and you've already heard me talk about that a bit. But this, from a DoD perspective, involves a range of activities: training, education, exercises, equipment, engagements of all kinds that seek to work with African partners who seek to work with the United States. We look in the course of those engagements to promote human rights, governance, and civilian control of the military, and I know that'll be part of the discussions that you have in the course of the week here. Two particular initiatives that I'd like to mention that the President rolled out a year ago at the Africa Leaders Summit that are consistent relate to the African Peacekeeping Rapid Response Program, which is really seeking to engage with a number of countries who have a track record of peacekeeping engagement and have shown the political will time and time again to respond, and working to enhance their ability to deploy going forward. A second one relates to the Security Governance Initiative, which is something that I'm hoping we'll talk about more on Friday, which has to do with defense institutions and security institutions more broadly. What we've noticed over time is many of our engagements are focused at an operational level on training and equipping partner forces, and we do less when it comes to the backbone institutions that are responsible for organizing, training, equipping of forces in terms of services and institutions. A second way that we seek to accomplish our objectives involves leveraging the efforts of others, or you could look at this as a collaboration and cooperation way, if you will. This involves within the U.S. government working with our partners who are responsible for diplomacy, State Department in particular, development, and in particular the U.S. Agency for International Development. And we seek to approach the work that we do holistically, engaging both diplomacy and development alongside the defense focus. The other has to do with working with the whole range of partners, whether it's the UN, whether it's the AU, whether it's the REX. I know we have several representatives from the regional economic communities here today. Whether it's working with partners, other external partners. I know I see some familiar faces from colleagues from France and other European partners in the room. We have that same willingness to work with other countries when there are opportunities for collaboration. So kind of the leveraging principle is something that is fundamental to our strategic approach. And then the final way is by being present, presence, if you will, or posture, but being present and available with respect to the right kind of forces in the right places at the right time. I'd like to return to the idea of the small footprint that I mentioned earlier. For example, I think you're aware that we have an enduring location, DoD location in Djibouti at Camp Lemonnier. It's the only location of its kind in Africa, and it is an important location with respect to activities, DoD activities in Africa, but also DoD activities in the Middle East and beyond. We also have arrangements with other countries in terms of intermittent access that we're granted, whether it's for purposes of training, whether it's for purposes of exercises. We have a couple of countries who have been willing to host U.S. ISR capabilities, both manned and unmanned, to assist our efforts to better understand the environment and to be able to share information and intelligence with partners that we gain from that. I don't want to take, I want to leave enough time for questions and answers. How am I doing?
Doing very well.
I'm doing very well. Okay. Sorry.
5-10 minutes.
Okay. Let me just quickly kind of jump from region to region and make a few comments and then open it up to questions. Maybe I'll start with Southern Africa first. In terms of Southern Africa is the region, at least from a DoD perspective, where you see at this point the least amount of conflict and the least amount of activity from violent extremist organizations. And that, I think, is clearly very positive development and is related to progress that has been made throughout Southern Africa in terms of governance and economic development. That said, the region isn't immune to violence, to include some of the activity that we've seen with respect to migration and challenges, for example, that South Africa has experienced most recently in terms of relative economic development in South Africa and the magnet effect from other countries in the region. There are also some interesting changing dynamics within Southern Africa. By some measures, Angola is rising as a superpower, and South Africa in some ways is declining as a superpower. And Zimbabwe, in some senses, remains frozen in time, but with significant potential. I think one of the things I would be interested in is discussing, particularly with those from the region, but also beyond, what trajectory you see Southern Africa on in the 5 to 10 years ahead. In Central Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo has been in close to continuous conflict, as you know, since independence from Belgium in 1960, and has weathered many different efforts, both in terms of diplomatic efforts and peacekeeping efforts to address the challenges there. One thing from a DoD perspective that we're very concerned about is efforts by President Kabila at this point to pressure MONUSCO to depart from DRC, which we think would be unfortunate development in terms of the stability both for DRC and the broader continent. The ethnic conflict that we saw in Rwanda and successfully resolved since the genocide 20 years ago seems to be bubbling in ways that are concerning to us as well right now when we look at the recent election in Burundi and the accusations back and forth across the border, Rwanda, Burundi, the broader region. We're very concerned from a USG perspective, and of course DoD within that, in terms of the potential for instability and the potential for atrocities if things are to get out of hand. On a more positive note, I think you're aware that Department of Defense has been working closely with the African Union's regional task force to combat the Lord's Resistance Army for several years now with very positive results in terms of the Lord's Resistance Army is practically unable to operate at this point, and the destabilization that was happening in Uganda, Central African Republic, DRC, South Sudan has largely been put to rest. In East Africa, just very briefly, we remain very concerned about the threat from Al-Shabaab and its work. Increasingly under pressure in Somalia, it continues to threaten the government in Mogadishu, as well as the Amisom peacekeeping force, as well as attacks into the countries that provide the troops for the Amisom peacekeeping force. So Shabaab is weaker than it has been in years, thanks to the efforts of Amisom, but is far from having been resolved at this point and remains very high in terms of the work that we do with East African partners. In terms of the federal government of Somalia, we're very encouraged by the progress that it has made in a relatively short period of time, and diplomatically continue to urge them forward as fast as they can. And in particular, 2016 is an important election opportunity for the Somali government, and one where we and other elements of the international community will seek to support them to the maximum extent possible. In North Africa and the Maghreb, that's part of the portfolio from a DoD perspective. We treat the continent of Africa as a whole, and of course we're continuing to see the aftermath and after effects of the Arab Spring and the removal of Gaddafi from Libya. We've seen varying degrees of political reform, with Tunisia the farthest along at this point, but paying dearly for it in terms of becoming really a magnet in terms of efforts to undermine its progress on the part of extremists. And then Libya still struggling, competing governments, an initial agreement in place, a certain amount of optimism on the one hand, but I think really grave concerns about the ability to implement the agreement productively going forward. In the Sahel, very briefly, we continue to be concerned. I mentioned the fragility of Sahel nations at the outset. We're working along with many other partners with Sahel governments and seeking to shore them up in terms of their security. But it is very challenging in terms of the violent extremist organizations who continue to have free passage from Libya into the region. and the Tuareg rebellion in Mali, of course, has set the region back a considerable amount. And finally, West Africa and the Lake Chad Basin. So much attention was focused on Ebola over the past year. We can talk about that in the question and answer session a bit. The Department of Defense was called upon by President Obama to undertake some extraordinary measures when the civilian response was insufficient or faltering, and we have since relinquished that role back to the U.S. Agency for International Development in terms of the U.S. part of the response. But although Ebola is not finished in terms of Mono River Union, I think the very encouraging news in terms of the containment approach, coupled with the recent vaccine news, gives us all cause for hope going forward. And then just a word or two, Lake Chad Basin, Boko Haram clearly has developed from being a Nigeria-focused insurgency into a broader phenomenon and that threatens the region to include Chad and Cameroon. And I think that's an area where we were privileged to have President Buhari come and visit Washington the week before last, and I think there are some very encouraging signs post-election and the work that the region is doing together, that the political will is there to address the threat of Boko Haram, and the United States and others will be standing by to figure out the best way to engage both bilaterally and then with the Lake Chad Basin countries as a whole. Let me stop there and open it up for dialogue, for questions, any comments you may have. Thank you very much.